Welcome, everyone. I'm Dr. Jody Jacobson Fry, co-chair of the Workplace Suicide Prevention Committee. Welcome to our webinar today on tips for supporting others during emotional fires. I'm honored to introduce our guest speaker today. Dr. Ursula Whiteside is clinical faculty at the University of Washington, as well as faculty for the Zero Suicide Initiative. She is the founder and CEO of Now Matters Now organization and a leading voice in the suicide lived experience field. Today's webinar is part of the National Guidelines for Workplace Suicide Prevention, which was forged by a partnership among the American Association of Suicidology, the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, and the United Survivors of Suicide International. Our goals for today's workshop are to understand the stress model, to have a better understanding of lived experience-based recommendations, and to review the stop, drop, roll steps for emotional fires. The national guidelines are founded upon 8 guiding principles. Today, we will focus on the guiding principle of well-being promotion. The guidelines are also comprised of 9 practices, which start upstream, go midstream, and downstream. Today, we will focus on crisis response, including accommodation, reintegration, and postvention. So without further ado, I am thrilled to turn this presentation over to Dr. Whiteside. Thank you so much for being here today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. So I think of myself primarily as a researcher, as a clinician, and as someone who tries to get free resources that are evidence-based to the population at whole. And most of my training was with a woman named Linehan, who was an expert in treatment for people who were highly suicidal, struggling with suicide attempts, and intense suicidality, and having so over a long period of time. What I want to talk to you about first today is something I call the stress model, which is short for the Biopsychosocial theory of emotion dysregulation. So I just call it the stress model. I find this useful for understanding how it is that some people struggle with suicidal thoughts and may turn to suicide as a way of managing their experiences. So what you see here is an image that has time along the bottom. So we're looking at a period of time. Up the left-hand side is stress. So this might be from 0 to 100, how stressed someone is in the given moment. You see you've got a green and a gray portion. And we'll just call them Mr. Green and Mr. Gray. So these are 2 different people, but it also could be the same person at different time points in their life. What I want you to focus on first is the portion to the far left. We call this our day-to-day baseline level of stress. The level of stress we have just walking through the world on average when things are going at their norm. For some people, their average level of stress, or maybe most people, might be more like a 30-40 on a day-to-day level. They've got some stress going on board, they're operating. But for some people, their day-to-day stress level is much higher. They're maybe more operating at a 50 or a 60, that intensity is carried with them. And that might be due to their biology, so the wiring that they inherited. That might be due to the history, things that have happened in their life that have led up to this. Or it could be current life circumstances that have just pumped that stress level up to a higher level. And what happens if you're somebody who's wired in this way or living in this higher stress state, when something stressful happens, maybe a day-to-day stressor, your reaction may be stronger, it may be more quick, and it may go higher and take longer to come down. And so you see that with Mr. Gray, that stress level was already high to begin with. Something stressful happened, the stress went up really rapidly to a higher point, and it took longer to come back down. In fact, it never got back to its original level. When somebody is living in this state, and perhaps there have been times in your own life when your stress level has been higher, when people are living in this state, they don't necessarily know that they are different than other people, and other people don't necessarily know what's going on under the covers for someone else. But it makes sense that when your emotions and your stress gets to a certain level, that you have more difficulties. It's just the way the biology of the brain works. You get to a certain level, your emotions, we say you become on fire emotionally. Your emotions can become engulfing. And there are a number of things that happen at the same time. So your body is having a full body response when your emotions get to a certain level. Your physiology is reacting, you're firing in different ways. You're more likely to have cognitive processing errors, difficulty thinking clearly. And for some people, when they get to a certain state, it becomes so uncomfortable, really physiologically uncomfortable, cognitively uncomfortable, that they will do almost anything to escape. And sometimes they'll get a focus on one thing as a way of escapes. So for one person, the way that works for them for escape might be human connection. For another person who doesn't have that human connection currently in their life, or doesn't have the right people in their life, they might use something that might be less useful. So for some people, this ultimately might result in a suicide attempt where they would do anything other than do anything to feel other than the way that they feel currently. So we call this the stress model. The idea that the urge to escape makes sense when people's stress gets to a certain level. And for some people, due to a variety of factors, suicide might be the way that they come to as a way of escaping. And a little secret is that it can create even relief thinking about suicide. That people's brains think, if this were to pass, if I weren't to feel this way, then they get some relief from thinking about that. And I think that's just important to understand why it is that some people can get really stuck in this pattern. In my research and interviewing and working with suicidal people over the past 20 years, I do a lot of training. And ultimately, the advisors that I have, people with lived experience, I have some lived experience of myself of having had suicidal thoughts, but my team of people, they say, all the technical things you're teaching people how to do, Ursula, these therapeutic techniques are important. But what's more important when I'm suicidal is that people do the following 3 things. That they don't panic, that they are in some way present they're with me in some way. And then ultimately that they provide some hope in some way. And I want to add a disclaimer about this last one of adding hope. This does not mean that you're saying to them everything's going to be better. That can feel really invalidating when things haven't gotten better. But what you might say instead, if you were with somebody who's under a huge amount of stress or having suicidal thoughts, is let me help you get through the next 10 minutes. Let me help you get through the next 20 minutes. That is offering hope. Okay, so steps to take. How can I be helpful to someone in this situation? Well, you can follow those steps that I just mentioned, but you can also understand and know a stop, drop, and roll. So in interviewing 27 people who attempted suicide and trying to understand their experience, these 26 of these 27 had not had a plan to harm themselves when they woke up the morning of their very serious suicide attempt. And when I worked with them to try and understand what their experience was like, it was this feeling on fire emotionally. And so we crowdsourced what steps would you take? What would be a stop, drop, and roll for being on fire emotionally, in the sense that we have a stop, drop, and roll for being on fire physically. If you think about the stop, drop, and roll we learned in elementary school, none of us would have known what to do when if our shirt got on fire had we not learned those steps. Because you just can't think clearly them. It's important to know what to do ahead of time or to be around someone who knows what to do. So let's talk about the steps that we came up with that were based on people's expertise who'd been there, but also based on suicide experts, clinical experts, emotion experts. So these 3 steps, let me talk with you about what those are. The first step is to shut the physiology down. So your physiology, when somebody's at a certain level of stress, and then when they're also more likely to have suicidal thoughts, when they're at a certain level, it's so high that you need to tamp that physiology down. And sleep and cold are 2 ways of helping reset physiology. If you can help someone bring down that intensity, what will happen is that and help them get through the next 24, 48 hours if they're really, really hot emotionally, you'll see that they will feel differently, or they'll see that they feel differently most oftentimes. But they need something to help bring down that physiological intensity. So sleep, if somebody can do it, is important. Also using cold, because cold helps affect our vagus nerve that runs through our body. It helps affect our emotions. And using cold water, putting your face in a pail or a pan or even a sink with really cold water for 30 seconds in, 30 seconds out, can make a big difference. Cold packs can also work in the back of the neck, around the eyes and the forehead. That's something, it's like a hack, I would say, for helping bring down that stress level, to help that person think a little bit more clearly. This is an example of me using cold. There are videos on the nowmattersnow.org website. So that organization provides these free tools and resources. And one of them is to use cold. Videos of how to go about doing that are available there. The next step, knowing in advance or knowing what to do when somebody's struggling, is to help support them to not make any important decisions. To have a conversation that is, I know there is so much going on right now. Let's get through the next hour together. Let's get through the next 12 hours together. Let me help connect you with somebody who can sit with you. People do these things that they would never otherwise do when their emotions are really hot. And finally, what we know is people get super focused sometimes on finding a solution, and when that solution is suicide, it can be very dangerous. We're trying to find something that is so distracting that it's very hard to maintain that focus on suicide. And eye contact is a really powerful distractor. It's one of the most powerful distractors that we have, is making eye contact. So one solution is helping that person be present with you, making eye contact, helping them get out of their head. So those are a few of the tips that you can do. What I'd ask you to do is to think about who you might share these with. It doesn't have to be just about suicide. It's really about, what do you do to help somebody when their emotional intensity is at an 80 or a 90 or 100 out of 100? What do you do to help them? You be present, you be calm, you provide hope, and you help them shut those emotions down and not make important decisions. So this is based on the work of Marsha Linehan, developer of dialectical behavior therapy. And I encourage you to check out the Now Matters Now website, which includes a number of videos of different ways to cope with emotions and suicidal thoughts. And it includes this stop, drop, and roll.
Thank you so much, Dr. Whiteside. And please do check out the Now Matters Now website if you haven't had an opportunity. It's got fabulous resources. So in closing, we want to call all of you to action that are watching this webinar. If you haven't already, please go to www.workplacesuicideprevention.com and take the pledge to make suicide prevention a health and safety priority for your workplace or professional organization. We thank you again. Thank you, Dr. Whiteside, and thank you everybody who joined us today.